The year is 1940. Darkness is falling across Europe. Nation by nation, free people are succumbing to the relentless march of tyranny. Across the English Channel, the people of Britain watch and wait. The storm is coming for them too. The threat is not just of invasion, but of the annihilation of their way of life, their freedoms, their very identity. Now Britain stands almost alone, a final bastion against the encroaching tide of Nazism. In this desperate hour, the world needs more than just a politician. It needs a symbol. It needs a voice to remind them what they are fighting for, to give them strength when they have none left, and to roar in the face of the storm. The world needs a leader who will not flinch, who will not surrender, and who will choose to fight, no matter the cost. That voice, and that leader, was about to step onto the world stage. For years, Winston Churchill had been warning of the growing menace in Germany. He was often dismissed as a warmonger, a relic from a bygone era. His powerful speeches were frequently met with scorn or indifference. They ignored his pleas to rearm and to recognize the true nature of the Nazi regime. He was a lone voice in the political wilderness. Churchill had spent the 1930s in the political shadows, but he had not been silent. He used his time to study the rise of Hitler, to understand the threat he posed to humanity. He knew that appeasement was not a strategy for peace, but a recipe for a far greater war. His warnings fell on deaf ears. When the storm finally broke, the nation suddenly remembered the man who had been right all along. The years in the wilderness were over. Winston Churchill was called from the shadows to lead his country in its most perilous hour. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, he inherited a catastrophe. On that very day, Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. The so-called phony war was over, and the real, brutal conflict had begun with terrifying speed and efficiency. The French and British armies were in full retreat. The government was in disarray. The public was gripped by a growing panic. It was a moment of supreme crisis, a test that would have broken most leaders. Churchill, however, was uniquely suited for this challenge. He had waited his entire life for this moment. He did not offer false hope or easy promises. In his first speech to the House of Commons as Prime Minister, his words were stark and resolute. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat," he declared. This was not the language of a typical politician. It was the language of a warrior. He was telling the British people the truth. The path ahead would be agonizingly difficult. There would be immense suffering and sacrifice. But in that brutal honesty, there was also a profound inspiration. He was treating them as adults, as partners in a great and terrible struggle. He was not managing their fears. He was calling forth their courage. This was the beginning of his true mission. Churchill understood that this war would be fought not just on the beaches and in the skies, but in the minds and hearts of the people. His primary weapon was language. His words became his artillery. Through radio broadcasts that reached every home in the nation, he forged an unbreakable bond with the British public. He gave voice to their deepest fears and their fiercest defiance. He painted a picture of a noble cause, a struggle between good and evil, between the survival of Christian civilization and the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister by the lights of perverted science. His leadership was a performance of epic proportions, designed to rally a nation and inspire the world. He was more than just a prime minister. He became the living embodiment of British resistance. His bulldog scowl, his V for victory sign, his ever-present cigar, these became global symbols of defiance. In the darkest days, when all seemed lost, when Britain stood alone against a triumphant Nazi empire, it was Churchill's voice that echoed across the airwaves, promising to fight on, whatever the cost may be. He was the man for the hour, the voice of resistance who would change the course of history. Winston Churchill's journey began with struggle. Born into aristocracy, his childhood was far from idyllic. He craved his parents' approval but rarely won it. School was equally challenging. He struggled with subjects that didn't capture his imagination, preferring history and the English language. This resistance to authority was a defining trait. Fascinated by military history, he spent hours reenacting battles with toy soldiers. Ultimately, a military path seemed open to him. He failed the Royal Military College entrance exam twice, finally succeeding on his third attempt. For Winston, it was a beginning. The unpromising youth was about to find his purpose in battle. Churchill's early adulthood was a deliberate pursuit of danger and glory on the farthest frontiers of the British Empire. As a young cavalry officer and war correspondent, he threw himself right into the heart of the action. From Cuba to India, he learned that war was a brutal reality. He discovered his talent for writing, earning money by telling the stories of the wars he was fighting. His vivid dispatches brought the reality of imperial warfare home to the British public. During the Boer War, after being captured, he engineered a daring escape, becoming a national hero overnight. These experiences forged a leader with an understanding of military affairs and the courage for decisive action. He was ready to exchange his military uniform for the political arena. Churchill's political career began with bold moves, crossing party lines, championing reform, and modernizing the Royal Navy. His ambition led to both rapid rise and dramatic fall, most notably after the failed Gallipoli campaign in World War I. Blamed for disaster, Churchill was cast into political exile, enduring public scorn and isolation. He returned to the trenches, gaining a humbling perspective on war's true cost. These wilderness years forged his resilience and taught him the value of accountability and perseverance. The lessons of failure would become his greatest asset when the world faced its darkest hour. In the 1930s, Churchill's warnings about Nazi Germany were dismissed as alarmist. While others clung to appeasement, he saw the threat with clarity shaped by his deep study of history. He stood nearly alone, urging Britain to rearm and unite against fascism. His conviction was unyielding, forged by past failures and a sense of duty to defend freedom. When war finally erupted, the nation realized the truth in his words. Churchill, once ignored, was now the leader Britain desperately needed. Hitler's invasion of Norway exposed Chamberlain's failed leadership and shattered public confidence. The Norway debate in Parliament became a reckoning. Chamberlain's authority collapsed despite a technical victory. Britain needed a warrior, not a peacemaker. Lord Halifax was the establishment's choice, but Churchill's energy and resolve stood out. As the government teetered, the nation faced a pivotal decision. Churchill, long a controversial figure, was now seen as the only hope. The stage was set for a new leader to emerge in Britain's darkest hour. Churchill's path to Prime Minister was fraught with resistance from his own party and the King. Halifax, the preferred candidate, declined, citing the impracticality of leading from the House of Lords. The final decision fell to King George VI, who personally disliked Churchill, but recognized the necessity. On May 10, 1940, as German forces swept through Europe, the King summoned Churchill to form a government. Churchill accepted, feeling destiny's weight on his shoulders. The maverick outsider was now Britain's leader. The world's fate would hinge on his resolve. Churchill became Prime Minister as Nazi blitzkrieg overwhelmed Western Europe. He immediately formed a coalition government, uniting political rivals for the nation's survival. The military situation was dire. Allied forces were being driven to the sea, and panic gripped the continent. Churchill worked tirelessly from the cabinet war rooms, demanding information and decisive action. He faced catastrophe with relentless energy, rallying his colleagues and the nation. The storm had broken and Churchill stood at its center. Britain's fate now rested on his leadership. 3 days after becoming Prime Minister, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons. He chose the path of stark, brutal honesty. He explained the formation of his new all-party government, a government of national unity. Then came the words that would echo through history. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It was the raw language of a warlord rallying his tribe for a battle to the death. It is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might. It is victory, victory at all costs. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. The speech was a masterpiece of defiant leadership. By offering nothing but hardship, he called forth their strength. Winston Churchill knew the war against Nazi Germany would be a new kind of conflict. It would be a battle for the hearts and minds of millions. From the moment he became Prime Minister, Churchill's most crucial task was to forge the national will into an unbreakable weapon. His chosen instrument was the power of the spoken word, delivered through the magic of radio. In an age before television and the internet, the radio was the nation's hearth. Churchill seized upon this technology with genius. His speeches were national events, intimate conversations with every household. He possessed a unique and unforgettable voice. He carefully crafted his speeches, practicing their delivery to achieve the maximum emotional impact. He spoke to them as equals, as fellow countrymen engaged in a sacred cause. He used simple, powerful words that everyone could understand. In the darkest hours, his voice was a beacon of light. In May 1940, Britain faced a military disaster. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk. The miracle of Dunkirk saw naval and civilian boats rescue over 300,000 soldiers. Churchill knew it wasn't a victory, but a colossal defeat, with vital equipment lost. Britain was vulnerable. Addressing the House, Churchill conveyed the gravity of the situation. He acknowledged the heroism, but warned against seeing Dunkirk as a victory. He declared, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." He turned disaster into a statement of spiritual victory, inspiring hope and defiance. Weeks after Dunkirk, the situation worsened. Paris fell to the German army. Soon after, France surrendered. The British Empire stood alone against Nazi-dominated Europe. A German invasion was imminent. On June 18th, Churchill addressed the nation, preparing them for the Battle of Britain. He stated that the Battle of Britain is about to begin. This was not just a fight for Britain's survival, but for the freedom of all. He urged them to brace themselves so that men will still say, this was their finest hour. He inspired them to live up to that heroic image. He asked them to be great. Churchill's speeches were strategic weapons. In a total war, public resolve was a center of gravity that had to be protected. His words made any compromise impossible, committing the nation to fight to the death. He was speaking to the British people, his government, and the world. His words also served as a powerful tool of international diplomacy. Churchill's speeches were broadcast across America, and they had a profound impact. He presented the struggle as a global fight for freedom. On the home front, the speeches gave people the strength to endure the horrors of the Blitz. Churchill forged words into a weapon of hope. He offered a vision of defiance, honor, and eventual victory. He used the radio to spread courage like a wildfire. His speeches were a central part of the war effort itself. He proved that words could be as powerful as bullets. Having failed to invade, Hitler turned to a terrifying new strategy: to bomb Britain into submission. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe shifted its focus to London itself. This was the beginning of the Blitz, a period of nightly bombing that would test the nation's will. Night after night, the bombers returned, aiming to shatter the spirit of the civilian population. Churchill refused to hide away, becoming a constant presence on the streets of London. He shared the danger with his people, offering not pity, but a sense of shared purpose. Churchill famously watched the air raids, a gesture of contempt that strengthened the resolve of others. While civilians endured the Blitz, the nation's fate rested on the young fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force. Tasked with defending Britain's skies against the Luftwaffe, they faced a numerically superior enemy. Churchill understood the vital importance of this aerial battle. It was during this desperate battle that Churchill coined one of his most memorable phrases: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Churchill gave the pilots an identity and a legend, turning their struggle into an epic of heroism. The Blitz continued through the autumn and winter of 1940. Night after night, the bombs fell on London and other British cities. The destruction was immense. Homes, factories, churches, and hospitals were turned into rubble. Life was reduced to survival, endurance, and a stubborn refusal to give in. The spirit of the British people did not break. This resilience was captured in the popular phrase, "London can take it." Churchill was the voice of this spirit. He framed their suffering as a noble sacrifice in the fight for freedom. The people of Britain passed the test of the Blitz with flying colors. It proved to Hitler that this was a nation that would not be easily cowed. He stood with his people in the storm, and together they weathered its full force. By the end of 1940, Britain had survived. The Battle of Britain had been won, and the threat of an immediate invasion had receded. The Blitz, though still ongoing, had failed to break the nation's spirit. These were immense achievements, a testament to the courage of the few and the resilience of the many. But the strategic situation remained dire. Britain and its empire stood completely alone. The whole of Western Europe was under Nazi control. The Soviet Union was still bound to Germany by a non-aggression pact. America remained on the sidelines, offering aid, but not yet arms. The path to victory seemed impossibly long and lonely. Churchill's great challenge during this period was to simply keep the fight going. He had to manage resources, build up the armed forces, and fight a global war in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and North Africa with limited means. It was a monumental balancing act. He had to give the nation a sense of purpose and a credible hope for eventual victory, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. His leadership was the glue that held the entire war effort together. He worked tirelessly, driving his government and military commanders with a relentless energy, convinced that if Britain could just hold on, its fortunes would eventually turn. His strategy was one of survival and resistance. He called it setting Europe ablaze. He authorized the creation of secret organizations like the Special Operations Executive, with the mission to support resistance movements in occupied countries. He believed in hitting the enemy wherever and whenever possible, using commandos, bombing raids, and naval blockades to disrupt the German war machine. These actions were often small in scale, but they were huge in symbolic importance. They showed the world, and the occupied peoples of Europe, that Britain was still in the fight, that the flame of resistance had not been extinguished. This period of standing alone was Britain's crucible. It was the time when the nation's character was tested to its core. Churchill's leadership was the critical element that ensured it did not fail. He provided the unshakable self-belief that the nation desperately needed. He was the rock against which the storm of 1940 had crashed and broken. He had successfully guided his country through its most perilous year, ensuring its survival against all expectations. The long, lonely fight was far from over, but thanks to his leadership, Britain was still standing, battered but defiant, ready to inspire a world to join its cause. While the world watched, occupied Europe lived under the shadow of the swastika. News from Britain was a fragile flicker of light. Every German bomber shot down, every night of the Blitz endured, every defiant speech broadcast was a symbol that resistance was not futile. Churchill became a figure of almost mythical stature, the leader of the free world in exile. His words became precious scripture for resistance movements. He gave them a language of defiance and the moral authority to continue their struggles. It ensured the war was a global coalition of free nations against tyranny. The symbolism of Britain's stand was immense. They held up a beacon of hope for a subjugated continent. On the other side of the Atlantic, the United States watched Britain's lonely struggle with a mixture of admiration, pity, and deep-seated reluctance to get involved. The trauma of the First World War had fostered a powerful isolationist movement. Many Americans saw the conflict as another European quarrel that was none of their business. They were protected by a vast ocean, and the idea of sending their sons to fight and die on foreign soil once again was deeply unpopular. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was personally sympathetic to Britain's cause, but he was a shrewd politician who knew he could not get too far ahead of public opinion. He walked a careful tightrope. Churchill understood this dynamic perfectly. His primary strategic goal, beyond mere survival, was to bring the industrial and military might of the United States into the war. He knew Britain could not win alone. To achieve this, he embarked on a campaign of personal diplomacy, conducted through letters, telegrams, and secret telephone calls with Roosevelt. He established a remarkable personal relationship with the American president, one of the most important in modern history. He laid bare Britain's desperate situation, but always framed his requests for help within a narrative of shared values and a common looming danger to democracy everywhere. His speeches were his most powerful tool in this campaign. They were broadcast on American radio networks and reported extensively in the press. His words, full of defiance and historical grandeur, captivated the American public. He presented Britain not as a victim begging for help, but as a proud warrior defending the front line of civilization. When Americans heard him vow to never surrender, they were not just hearing a politician, they were hearing the voice of freedom itself. This heroic narrative slowly but surely began to erode the foundations of isolationism. It made it harder for Americans to look away, framing support for Britain as a noble and necessary act. This constant, powerful communication laid the groundwork for crucial American support. It led to the Destroyers for Bases deal, and most importantly, the landmark Lend-Lease Act of March 1941. This act transformed the United States into what Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, providing Britain with a vital lifeline of food, oil, and war materials. Churchill's words had effectively built a bridge of ships and supplies across the Atlantic. He had not yet brought America into the war as a combatant, but he had made it an indispensable partner. He had convinced a reluctant nation that Britain's fight was also their fight. Churchill's vision always extended beyond Britain's solitary struggle. He knew that victory could only be achieved through a powerful coalition of nations. His immediate focus was on the United States, but he was also acutely aware of the other great powers on the world stage. He watched the tense relationship between his temporary ally, the communist Soviet Union, and his democratic friend, the United States, with great care. He understood that holding these ideologically opposed giants together would be a monumental task, requiring all his skill as a statesman, a strategist, and a persuader. The survival of the world depended on this unlikely and often fraught partnership. In June 1941, when Hitler betrayed his pact with Stalin and invaded the Soviet Union, Churchill did not hesitate. Despite his lifelong vehement opposition to communism, he immediately went on the radio and offered a British alliance to Joseph Stalin. If Hitler invaded hell, he famously quipped, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. This was the ultimate act of pragmatism. He recognized that the enemy of his enemy was his ally. This swift decision was crucial in forming the Grand Alliance of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, the coalition that would ultimately crush the Axis powers. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 finally brought the United States fully into the war. Upon hearing the news, Churchill felt a profound sense of relief, later writing, "So we had won after all." He knew that with America's full industrial and military power unleashed, victory was now certain. He immediately traveled to Washington to coordinate strategy with Roosevelt. His leadership was now central to managing this vast, complex global alliance. He was the vital link, the experienced senior partner who could mediate between the democratic ideals of Roosevelt and the brutal demands of Stalin, holding the fragile coalition together through sheer force of personality. Churchill's inspiration had become a global phenomenon. His initial lonely defiance had bought the world precious time. It had shown that Hitler could be resisted. It had inspired the resistance movements in Europe, courted the sympathy and support of the United States, and laid the groundwork for the Grand Alliance. He had been the spark that lit the fire of worldwide opposition to Nazism. The voice that had rallied a single nation in its darkest hour was now conducting a global symphony of resistance. His unwavering stand had not only saved his own country, it had created the very possibility of a free world to save. Winston Churchill's legacy is etched into the 20th century. In the crucible of 1940, he became the leader the moment demanded. His true genius was understanding that the war against Nazism was a war of the human spirit. By giving voice to courage, hope, and defiance, he armed the British people with a weapon that bombs could not destroy. His leadership was a masterclass in communication and inspiration. He transformed a desperate struggle into a noble crusade for the freedom of all humanity. He gave meaning to their suffering and purpose to their sacrifice. The echo of his defiance continues to resonate. He remains a universal symbol of resistance against tyranny. One voice, speaking with clarity, conviction, and courage, can rally a nation and inspire the world. It affirms the profound impact of individual will. His ultimate legacy is the free world he fought so fiercely to save.